Hey everybody, today we're going to do another water change video here on the Gourami tank, but instead of doing my normal 75% water change, we're going to do a very small water change today. Now normally in my water change videos I will say at some point that I don't recommend doing these huge water changes unless you're very confident and secure that you know what your water is doing and you're not going to be shifting your water chemistry dramatically, because there's things you can do to your tank that can really disrupt your cycle. It can disrupt your fish. It can even kill fish if you don't really know what you're doing when you do these massive water changes. Well, recently I was tinkering with my fairly elaborate water system, and I do have the ability to simply adjust my pH. And I, for reasons we'll get into, adjusted my pH down a little bit. And I wound up having a little bit of a backlash, and some unexpected results happened. And again, we're going to probably talk a little bit more about this as the video goes on. But what it really drove me to was start to test a lot of my tanks a lot more carefully with the pH, and looking at my source water's pH and monitoring my source water's pH over a period of time, which is also important and we'll get into. The result being is that I'm not now comfortable doing a very massive water change on this tank yet. I have adjusted my pH back. As time goes on, things will get back to normal. But another thing I've done recently is I've also changed the way I manage my tanks. I haven't been feeding them as much. I've been reducing the amount of lighting. A lot of you know that I've been doing all this in an attempt to control my algae. Well, in the process of doing that, I now manage my tanks differently, so that also has an impact on the water chemistry in the tank because I'm not doing water changes as frequently. So size of water change and frequency of water change are important. And as I always say, everybody's tank is different. Every single one of my tanks is different, and they all have to be looked at as individuals. You can't simply look at what I'm doing and say, oh, well, I watched this guy do this huge water change and his fish were fine, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Your water is not my water. Your tank's not my tank. You can't necessarily do that. So today I want to talk a little bit more about why I can and can't do some of the things I can do. So let me get started. We're going to do, like I said, a fairly small water change. We are going to go look at some water testing during this video, and then of course at the end we will wrap it up with any final thoughts and a little bit of a before and after. Again, not going to be a huge difference in this one today because I'm not taking a ton of water out, and I already wiped the glass down and all of that just a few days ago when I did another small water change just a few days ago. So we'll get into that as well. So let me get started, and we will be over at the testing station in the next part of this video, and I will see you there. Alright everybody, here we are over at my testing station. I'm going to try this with the flash on because we're going to be looking at my water system in a minute, so hopefully the glare won't affect what we're looking at. So what are we looking at here? First thing I want to do, I've been meaning to make this point for a while now. Can you see what these vials look like? These are empty. Those are just nasty vials that have been stained. That is what will happen if you do an ammonia test and then you let it sit overnight without emptying the vial and rinsing the vial out. It will actually etch the glass. To my knowledge, none of the other tests do that, but if you do an ammonia test and you leave it in the vial overnight, that is what your vial will look like the next day. It's ruined. So I have a few of those that I've ruined over the years, but getting to the test that it actually worked, what are we looking at here? This is my groundwater. It has a pH of 6. So it is very acidic coming out of the ground. This is my tap water. So it has gone through my system and it has come out. Let's see if I can do this without knocking it over. I'm not going to hold it up to the chart because it really doesn't matter. It never comes out on camera looking right anyway. But that is about 7.3. That's about where I want it coming out of my tap. This is what is in my tank, and that is about 6.6. Now it is 6.6, and it was last night as well. After I did a water change, I did about a 20%, and it did not shift the pH. But you can see the difference between what's coming out of my tap and what is in the tank. This is actually from my tap that I set out last night and allowed to degas overnight, and you can see here it is a little bit bluer. So the pH did actually come up some overnight, and that's going to be important when we continue this discussion over in the other room. So how does my pH go from that to that after going through all of this? Well, this is a water softening, neutralizing, and sterilizing system. So what all of that means is as the water comes out of the ground, in my case it's not actually very hard, so this doesn't do a lot of softening in the traditional sense. It starts out neutralizing the water, which is what this large canister right here is. And how it neutralizes the water is it actually adds calcium carbonate and magnesium oxide into the water, and that brings the pH up. And there is a valve here on the back of this canister that I can adjust how much of these solids I allow to dissolve into the water. That directs the flow in and out of this tank. What happens then is it goes into this smaller tank next to it, and that is the actual softener. And what a softener does is it removes calcium and magnesium from your water. So effectively, this neutralizer could also be thought of as a hardener. So it actually makes the water fairly hard to bring the pH up to where I want it. And then this unit here softens it back down, but the pH remains stable where I set it at about 7.3. So once it's gone through there, it actually goes through this unit, which is just a BioLite, and that kills any biologicals that might be alive in the water. And then it goes on up and into my house. So that's how we go from a very soft, acidic water coming out of the ground to water that is still soft, but has been hardened and neutralized and then softened, and the neutralization process stays intact. So I actually end up with water that is 7.3, right where I want it, and not this stuff that would actually eat my pipes away, and my appliances would dissolve in water that acidic. So let's go over and look at the progress on the tank. We'll see how far along we are, and that's probably about where we're going to stop and start filling it back up. I also do have this vial set aside of tank water, and once we're done filling the tank back up, we are going to get another sample, and we're going to do a before and after with nitrates, and then we are actually going to see what the end result of the pH looks like after I've blended the waters back together and filled the tank back up. So let's go have one look at the tank, and we'll see where we are. Alright. That's about where I wanted it to be, and we are now actually filling it up. I just started, so we are pretty much at the low point, and that's where I've drained the tank down to. Again, if you watch my videos regularly and you see my normal water change videos, this flat rock here on top is usually exposed above the water line when I'm finished emptying the tank. And when you consider how much rock and wood and everything I have on the bottom of the tank that's actually displacing water, that actually amounts to a very large water change for this tank. So this is still a significant water change. That's probably more than a 25%, or roughly a 25% water change. Again, doing it with the siphon the way I do, you don't really measure. If I was doing it by the 5-gallon bucket, I'd be able to give a little more accurate idea of how much I was taking out. I just kind of have to eyeball it, and I sort of have to mentally guess at how much displacement I've got with all those rocks and pieces of woodwork in there. So when I did the water change last night, we did about the same amount, maybe a little less, and it was not enough to really noticeably shift the pH after the change was done. So we're going to see if that's the case again today. I was able to bring the nitrates down last night. It was a little over 40 parts per million probably, and then after the water change I brought it down to under 30, but it still seemed like it was above 20, and that's why I wanted to do just a little bit more water change today. This is a very, very heavily stocked tank. I know it's hard to believe, but I have about 35 fish in this tank, and I have a grand total of about 115 inches of fish in here, and that is current size, not eventual estimated size. So that gives you an idea of how heavily stocked this tank is. It's ridiculously heavily stocked. And yet I can still manage to keep the nitrates under control, provided I manage the tank properly. And again, we're going to get into that a little bit once we're finished up with this. So let's go back over to the testing station, and we're going to see what the nitrates before and after look like, and we're going to see how much the pH has fluctuated after this size water change. Alright everybody, here we are with our after results. Now, I know this is focusing on pH, but I do want to take a moment and look at the nitrates here. I honestly can't tell you the difference between which one was the before and which one was the after. They both appear orange. They both do appear to be under 20 parts per million to my eye. I know these colors never come out looking quite right on camera. But the point being is that I honestly can't tell you which one is the before and which one is the after. I actually got them a little mixed up when I was doing the test, and I thought, well, it doesn't matter. I'll clearly be able to see which one's darker and which one's lighter, and I cannot. So that takes me back to what I've said before about the API test kit and reading the colors. When it comes to the nitrates, I don't really sweat too much over them. If it starts getting up to where it looks red, it's time to do a water change. As long as it stays down to where it looks orange, it's fine. So that's all we're going to talk about with the nitrates on this test. With the pH, the test on the far right here is the after test. This is my tap water. This is what we started with in the tank, and this is what we ended up with after the water change. Now, at a glance, you would just say these two are the same, and I did not make a significant impact on the pH, which is exactly what I was going for. I didn't want to make a big difference. Since we're looking at this and we're scrutinizing it and we're looking specifically for the slightest shift, you can tell there's a little tiny difference. Again, it's not even going to make a difference. The fish won't bat an eyelash at that, even if they had them. So let's go back over and look at the tank and talk a little bit more about what all this means and how tank maintenance and water changes impact all this stuff. Alright everybody, there you go. Not a whole lot of difference, but it does look a little nicer. It's a little more open. And I'm now actually going to put a little bit of sinking granules in the tank to reward everybody for being good fishies through the water change. This will give a little more activity, and it may make it a little more interesting to look at. I know it's a nice serene and relaxing tank, but it's always nice to see a little bit of fish activity too, so we can look at some fish swimming around while we talk about the test results we just looked at. So I think it's pretty obvious. I would hope everybody realizes that if the pH is very different coming out of your tap than it is in your tank, you don't want to do an extremely large water change, because that'll shift the pH in your tank too radically, and that'll be a shock to your fish. That's fairly straightforward. There's a lot more going on than that, though. We just saw how my pH does rise overnight, and this is fairly common. Dissolved CO2 in tap water is a fairly common thing, and what it does is it lowers your pH. So when you get it out of your tap and it's no longer in a pressurized situation, it's able to degas. And when it degasses, your pH rises. So depending on how much CO2 is in the water will depend on how much the pH rises. So even with my water having pH at 7.3, it still did rise a little bit overnight. And again, I'll recommend anybody that wants to can test their water this way. Simply pour yourself a glass of water, you test the pH, you wait overnight, you test the pH again in the same glass of water, and you see if there's any difference. If your pH has come up, then that means you've got CO2 in your water, and it will degas and your pH will shift. So when you do a water change, even if you check your pH immediately after a water change, you still need to come back 24 hours later and check it again and see if your tank has actually shifted more than you think it has. And that's what happened recently with me. I had noticed that where my tanks used to be very stable at around 7.3, where my tap water sits, lately my tanks have all been in the mid 6s, you know, anywhere between 6.4 and 6.6. And it's had me scratching my head as to why. And I'll get into that in a minute. I hope I get back to that. That is a point I want to make, because it's all to do with how we are managing the tank. So I decided, well, since I can shift my pH, instead of having my pH come out of the tap at 7.3, why not have it come out of the tap at 6.6, and I can match the tank, and that way I can still continue to do these massive water changes. So I completely forgot I had done this, and I made a shift in the pH 2 years ago probably. I'd already done this. I had lower pH, and there was a reason I rose it to 7.3, which is that's where the water wants to come back up to anyway. So when I lowered it the other day and I did a big water change on my 20-gallon tank, I thought everything was fine, and then suddenly I noticed that the fish were not acting right. Oh wow, I just got a little glimpse of my South American bumblebee that I've seen it about 4 times in the last 3 years that I've had it, or 2 years that I've had it. It's right there next to Link on the bottom, coming out of that cave, if you can actually see it. I know it's kind of dark down there. Link being the figure on the shelf in front of the tank, if you're not familiar with The Legend of Zelda. At any rate, I lowered my pH, I did the big water change in the tank, didn't check the pH of the tank before doing the water change. I made the assumption that since some of my other tanks were lower, so was that. All my tanks are the same after all, right? Well, the fish reacted immediately. I could definitely tell I did something wrong. I shifted the pH way out of whack. So I did go back and readjust my valve that we just looked at back to where it was. I just basically put everything back. But instead of messing with the tank anymore, I just let it sit and I waited overnight to see what happened. And sure enough, the next morning the pH was back up to around 7.3 and all the fish were swimming around perfectly normally. So there's a reason I moved it to 7.3 in the first place. There's also a reason my tanks used to always sit at 7.3. And that gets back into what I keep alluding to for my newer viewers, that I've sort of made this shift recently in how I manage my tanks. If you're a longer viewer, you know I used to just feed the crap out of my tanks. I used to feed them 5 or 6 times a day. And I always had fairly high nitrates. I always had vials of red test solution when I was done. I would do a massive water change and it would still be fairly red when I was done the water change. And I kept my tanks like that for a long time. I had crazy plant growth, I had crazy algal growth, and I actually kind of liked the way the tanks looked better. But I've decided that it's time to sort of step up the care and maintenance of my animals in my tanks, and I've reduced my feeding, and therefore I've also reduced the amount of nitrates in my tank. And more importantly, I've reduced how frequently I need to do water changes anymore. Instead of climbing up to 40 parts per million nitrates in 2 or 3 days, which is what I used to do, and I would wind up doing at least 2, sometimes 3 large water changes on this tank. So when the pH was at 7.3 and I was doing these big water changes 2 or 3 times a week, the tank never really had time to shift slowly downward, which is what will happen over time as the CO2 accumulates from the fish in there breathing, the tannins are leaching into the water from the big pieces of wood that are in there. And just over time, through a series of different chemical processes, you will actually lose pH in your tank if you don't have a lot of buffering capacity in your tank. My carbonate hardness is only about 1 to 2, so I don't have a lot of buffering capacity, and that means my pH is very susceptible to shifting. And that's what happens. Now that I've gone from doing these water changes twice a week, I'm now doing once every 2 weeks. I've still got my nitrates and my organics under control, but now I'm having to look at pH completely different. So this just ties back into what I always say about everything connects to and affects everything in your tank. The interconnectedness of everything you do in your tank makes some kind of impact. I always recommend whenever you make any kind of change in your routine, if you've done heavy maintenance, if you've just recently cleaned out your filter, I always recommend testing your tank as thoroughly as you're capable of, to the best of your ability and to the best of your limits, to the test equipment you have. I definitely recommend having at least a master test kit that gives you your pH test, it gives you an ammonia, a nitrite, and a nitrate test. And I often also recommend getting the general and carbonate hardness test kit, because those are also very important water chemistry parameters that you really should be aware of and really should have the capacity to check when you make changes to your tank, and just have a better understanding of what's going on in your tank. So that's what's been going on with my pH as of late. And it's really been this sort of interesting learning process of, since I've shifted the way I've always done my tanks to the way I'm doing them now, and I'm actually finding out as I'm explaining that a lot more things have changed than simply I don't have to do water changes as frequently, or the tank looks a lot different now. My plants don't grow the same as they used to. You know, again, just a lot is going on in my tanks. And this issue with the pH is something that's very interesting that's cropped up. And again, I'm not 100% positive that that's what's going on. But I don't know how else to explain that now that I'm not doing these water changes very frequently, my pH coming out of my tap is very different than the pH that's in my tanks. But I am aware of that now, and since I'm aware of that, I now have to go forward doing tank maintenance completely differently. I can no longer do these massive water changes once every 2 weeks because I will shift the pH too radically. So I'm still going to have to go back to doing these closer to once a week 10% type maintenance routine, and that will keep my water clean enough while not shifting my pH too radically. So that will be my final thought, and that is when you hear people say, you know, we often talk about the inch of fish per gallon of rule, water rule. Obviously, that is not a hard and fast rule. We're looking at a tank that blows that completely out of the water. I've more than doubled the amount of inches, and as I'm also explaining, I don't have any issues managing this tank at all. I know what I'm doing with this tank. I have mad biofiltration. I understand what's going on with my water. I don't recommend a novice overstocking a tank the way this is. I know what I'm doing. You can see how heavily it's planted, etc. So, excuse me. I completely lost my train of thought there. I was going to make some final point about testing your water, and now I've just completely lost it. Well, I'll just go ahead and wrap that up then, and if I can think of that final point, I will go ahead and tack that back in. Otherwise, we will call that the end of this video, because I feel like I've rambled on long enough. No, I do know what my final point was going to be. It was going to be about these sort of generic parameters you get. And when you read, I'll say the books or whatever that tell you how to manage a tank, they give you this inch of fish per gallon of water rule. They also give you this 10% weekly, 25% monthly water change. And that's something I can just as easily say, well, that's just nonsense, you know, it all depends on your tank. So what I'm getting back to is if I had to give somebody just sort of generic, I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and ask you 75 questions about what you've got going on in your tank and expect you to understand all of what's going on in your water. It's not my tank. I don't know these things. So I would say go ahead and do 10% weekly, 25% monthly, and that way you're never going to do one water change and accidentally throw your tank completely out of whack. Another thing that can happen, and this will be my final point, but a friend of mine did bring this up, and it is something that's worth noting. If you shift your pH too radically, you can also kill your nitrifying bacteria, or at least shock some of them, and you can disrupt your nitrogen cycle by doing too radical of a pH shift as well. So that's something to consider. And again, it's just one more reason that you really should test your water and test it for as many different parameters as you can. So now I really am going to wrap this up because I feel like I just completely derailed myself back there. I was on a nice little roll right up towards the end there. So thanks for watching this one. If you're not subscribed already, please go ahead and do so. I do a lot of different videos like this. You just never know what you're going to get with me. I'm always tinkering with something. I'm always figuring out something new, and the moment I do, I will share it with you. So thanks again for watching this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you real soon on the next one.